My research was on the resolution of conflicting category boundaries in bilingual language learners. So presently, there is not much research on the resolution of conflicting category boundaries in bilinguals, but much of Barbara Malt and Eve Emil's work explores this topic, so we've taken some inspiration from them. To start, it is important to understand reference. One of these pictures shown here is what some might call a cup or a mug in English. In other words, those are two referents available in English. On the other hand, in French, this may be referred to as a tasse, which is only one referent available. This is where some of the naming problems discussed in Emil and Malt's 2005 study come into play. So in the naming task in the study, participants looked at pictures of objects, such as the ones pictured here, and gave their best name for the item. There were substantial differences between the labels assigned in the naming task, but there was less variation among bilinguals compared to the monolinguals in the study. In other words, the bilinguals showed similar category structures with less labels in use than the monolinguals. The goal of the Emil et al. 2005 study was to evaluate the nature of the lexical knowledge of Dutch-French bilinguals. And this study was later revisited in the 2009 study, also by Emil. And this figure is from the 2009 study, and it demonstrates the difference in categories between bilinguals and monolinguals for the reference given to the objects pictured here. So in the upper left-hand figure, you could see how French-speaking monolinguals subdivide these categories into bouteille and flacon, while Dutch-speaking monolinguals only use the referent flis for both objects. And to the right of that figure is the category structure that was shown across the majority of the Dutch-French bilinguals in the study. So as you can see, this category structure eliminates the use of the referent flacon and creates a simpler structure than that of the French monolinguals. And this simpler structure reflects Dutch or their first language category representation. In the example below that, the bilinguals once again simplify the categories, but instead change their representation to reflect the French category structure, which is their second language. And these findings suggest that the bilinguals' category structures take influences from both of their languages and drop specificities of the more complex category structure within the stimulus space. And this phenomenon is known as semantic convergence. So that's where concepts across languages are represented more similarly within bilinguals relative to across these same languages within monolinguals. So as demonstrated in the experiments I just discussed, bilinguals deal with conflicting category boundaries within their real-world languages, but our research wanted to take this idea into an artificial language learning paradigm. So using this paradigm allows us to test an individual's ability to deal with these conflicting category boundaries while eliminating cultural effects and other confounds found in real-world languages. So previously, our lab, specifically Dr. Elizabeth Cruza and Dr. John Patterson, conducted an experiment where monolingual participants attempted to learn two artificial languages in a sequential format. The first phase of this experiment included a learning phase of language 1 and a test on language 1. And then the second phase of the experiment included a learning phase of language 2, a test on language 2, and then a retest on language 1. These pre and post tests of language 1 were then used in the analysis to determine the effects of learning the second language on the representation of language 1. After considering using active learning or information we select to explore the category boundaries within these two artificial languages, we decided that passive learning or information that is received was a better way to conduct the experiment in an online format, as it allowed us to streamline data collection. So stimulus were presented as shown here, where a statement below was given from a teacher who the participants know as an alien that was teaching them their language. Oh, sorry about that. There were also 100 stimuli presented per language. After learning, participants proceeded to 100 trials of testing, where they used the classification scale that is shown here to rate the stimulus shown. This classification provided class-tied typicality ratings, which was our primary measure. And typicality in this sense is the degree to which the stimulus presented reflects the category labels provided. And all of this format from the previous work was also used in the current experiment. Okay, so within the experiments, there are two subconditions. The first subcondition is the presentation of language A as L1 and the presentation of language B as L2. And the second subcondition is the reverse of that, where language B is presented first. This is relevant due to the change in size of the categories presented within each language. And results from that previous experiment showed a change in the representation of language 1 after learning language 2 for both of these subconditions. And after replicating this in another monolingual experiment, we wanted to see if the same effect would be seen in the bilingual participants. Our research question also extended further to ask the extent to which the bilingual experience would modulate these effects. To begin the current experiment, participants completed a Lextail test in order to check the participants' levels of proficiency, specifically in English for this. After the Lextail test, I conducted a verbal interview over Zoom with participants to collect information on their language experience and usage. This interview was an edited version of the Language History Questionnaire by Lee et al. 2020. And the questions that I show here are just two of the questions that were used in the interview. And an important thing to note is that all of the questions used were asked for both English and Polish. Now moving on to the results. These tile plots represent the pre-post change across the fuzzy space, or the category conflicting space. And the concept space shown here reflects the colors shown within these tile plots. So purple represents an extremely perfect member of category 1, while yellow represents an extremely perfect member of category 2. Within the subcondition where language A is presented first, we would expect the plot to appear more yellow in the pre-test and more purple in the post-test due to the effects of learning language B second. But as you can see, there is not much change in that first subcondition. Within the subcondition where language B is presented first, we would expect the exact opposite change. So we would expect the plot to appear more yellow as a result of learning language A second. Results within this subcondition showed a significant difference within L1 representation after learning the second category. And this is only where the broader category was presented first. So language B was presented first. And as mentioned, our previous experiment showed a significant change within both of these subconditions. So this result was not replicated within the bilingual learners. When analyzing subconditions individually, only within the subcondition that goes from the larger boundary to the smaller one was a significant pre-post change observed. This finding suggests that bilingual learners may favor a smaller category structure to eliminate unnecessary referent interference from a larger category. As seen in past research, bilinguals appear to favor less complex category structures within their real languages due to memory constraints. So this may be reflected in the artificial setting. As monolinguals do not use this strategy in their daily lives, they may be less likely to favor these smaller category structures and simply be impacted by whatever language was presented to them most recently in the artificial learning. This is one possible explanation of why the results from the monolingual experiments were different than the results from this experiment. So next, we wanted to look further into the effects of individual language history on the participants' abilities to reconcile these conflicting category boundaries. To do so, we first performed a principal component analysis to shrink our amount of variables taken from the language history questionnaire and to discover what variables were most impactful on the data set. After running the analysis, we found components 3 and 4 to be most relevant to our data. Some of the most relevant variables within these components included the average number of hours spent talking to family or coworkers, the average number of hours spent reading or writing for school or work, and the average number of hours spent reading for fun or using the internet. So we then collapsed our data to add power to language history, and after performing these analyses, an interaction was found between language proficiency and components 3 and 4 of the principal component analysis, suggesting a possible relationship between language 2 intensity of use and proficiency that has an impact on representational change. However, the exact interpretation of these results is still being worked on. So we have seen bilinguals prefer simpler referent label mapping structures in the real world languages. In an artificial language setting, these structures are unidimensional. However, there is a difference in the amount of stimuli presented in each category. In the paradigm we presented, there were 2 labels that matched either a smaller or a broader range of stimuli, and only within the subcondition where the broader category was presented first and the smaller category was presented second was a significant result found. And with all of this information in mind, I make the connection that bilinguals interpret the artificial stimuli as interference in creating their definitions of the categories. So bilinguals settle on a compromise between words and objects to solve the memory constraints. Therefore, bilinguals prefer these smaller category boundaries to deal with these same memory constraints found in real-world languages, but for the stimuli presented in the artificial paradigm instead of the labels. Future studies may also be conducted that involve a different set of stimuli or even a different group of bilingual participants, such as Spanish-English bilinguals, or a different age range of participants, as 18 to 30-year-olds were used in this study. So that may produce different results than 60 to 80-year-olds, for example. And I would like to just give a quick acknowledgement to Dr. Elizabeth Caruza and Dr. John Patterson for helping me with all of this and being there for me this entire process. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Language Science here and PIRE, as well as my PIRE partner, Dr. Sofia Vodnica, for all of their support and help with this project. And I'll open it up for some questions.